Welcome to Grief and Gratitude Podcast. We're your hosts, Mandy and Crystal.
This is a space for honest conversations about loss, healing, and everything in between. Each week, we share stories, perspectives, and moments that remind us that even in the hardest seasons, gratitude can still exist. Thank you for sharing space with us. We're really glad you're here. Hey everyone, welcome back to Grief and Gratitude Podcast. And I'm going to hand it over to Crystal to introduce him.
Thank you, Mandy. We are here today with Dan, who we have some mutual friends, knows some of my family. He had seen, leave info on the podcast and had reached out to us and shared that he'd be willing to share his story. So Dan, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Awesome, Crystal and Amanda. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. It's definitely something that I could not have done, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, but certainly feel like now it's a great part of, my growth and being able to share my story and just hoping that it could impact somebody, help somebody. That means a lot to me. So I'll start, sort of made a little timeline. My son was born, Gunnar, 2014, and we were living in Westford, Vermont. I had been actually working at an alternative high school for 7 years in my early 20s. And my now ex, my wife at the time, Leah, we both decided, that I was going to start my own business. And I was extremely grateful for that experience. But Gunnar was now, 16. He was, 18 months, and my ex had some migraines, and the flexibility seemed like it was a better fit for our family, So in the summer of 2000, we were coming on to, the vaccination stages. We were actually a little late for his 16-month, I think, MMR. And we were a little hesitant, and unsure, but we figured we'd just follow the program. And in July, around I think his appointment was on the 13th or 14th. Gunnar did receive his MMR, and I, from the next day on, which would have been July 14th, 15th, the day before his passing, he became very ill. It's hard for me to remember all the little things, and I think that's just was sort of my defense mechanism to keep that. But I remember he had a runny nose, and he had a lot of cold symptoms and nothing crazy. And then Leah and I were sitting on the couch, and he went into this sort of benign seizure like episode. And we called his pediatrician immediately. And now this was July 15th, the day before his passing. And, they basically said all the same things, a doctor would say, on call. Has he been eating? How's his behavior? Is he drinking? Lee and I weren't even sure what we saw, because when kids obviously get fatigued and tired, they, they're sleepy, right? They'll nap. But it was definitely very worrisome to us. And so we did what the doctor, said. He said, put him to bed just like you normally would, and he'll be fine. And so we did that, and we put him to bed, and at that we weren't co-sleeping. We weren't co-sleeping parents. Leah did a really good job with the sleep training, and he was in his own crib. So we went to bed, and woke up in the morning, and I remember being like, it was probably like 7:30. And he was an early riser. And I remember being like, wow, we've never been able to have coffee together, And I remember that we had coffee that morning. And we were just thinking, we were watching him on the monitor, and he was face down, and we were, I was like, I'm going to go outside, and he's probably just tired, right? He's a sick kid that they might sleep in. And I remember going outside, and then I, I'll know I try not to think about this much, but I'll never, forget the coming out and just, extremely distraught. And, we called 911 and they came and, there at that point, he was, it had likely been in the middle of the night. So I don't even remember how I got to the hospital. I know Leah went with the ambulance. I feel like I went behind. So I want to talk about a little bit about, the classification of death for my son, because a lot of people don't even know about this classification of death. And a lot of people will mix it up with SIDS. And SIDS is for, children 0 to 12 months, and it's related to suffocation. My son did not suffocate. He was a perfectly freakishly strong, no, almost 2-year old. He was 20 months at this point. Um, he was freakishly strong, little guy. And, the sudden unexplained death in children, SUDC, which I am part of that group, is really 2 years, I believe, to like 20 years old, and it's unexplained, right? So you go through the autopsy process and that sort of thing, and his autopsy is perfect. It's a really hard thing. I still struggle with this because it's a really hard thing to understand that this day and age, his autopsy would be perfect. And we had all the genetic testing and everything you can imagine. Um, and yeah, that was the cause of death. So obviously, as a parent, given what we had seen after the vaccinations, and I know this is a very controversial topic, and I'm not an anti-vaxxer, but I also, because I do respect everyone's decision and understand, that 99.9% of the time, kids are going to be fine following the program, right? But their medicine is not one size fits all. And, I do feel like for whatever reason with his genetic makeup, there was something that triggered a febrile seizure or something. And then his body couldn't respond. So that's really hard. And I go back and forth from like, it's really hard, but also makes it feel more special, if that makes sense. Like he was just on this earth, for the short period of time, like just as a gift, and he was actually maybe my daughter, or my daughter is now him, or I don't know. It's, he was a higher power and fulfilled his time here as a gift. And um, we're lucky that we had that time. Did I feel that way year 1, 2, and 3? Absolutely not. I was angry. I was pissed. I was not a happy person. And it took me like probably 4 years to get to that point of gratitude. And ultimately it was, having my daughter, and I'll talk about that. But do you guys have any questions about that part of it up to this point?
I was just going to ask, it must have been really hard to maintain your relationship with your wife after going through such a tragedy.
Yeah. I mean, we're we're now divorced. So the trauma and the grief, I mean, it changed us both. I'd say we took different paths, So back to that day, we never we went back to the house once, the Westford house. My parents had given me some land. I built a beautiful house. We felt like that was the right thing for us to do. Ultimately, you never know what the right thing to do is when you're in that grief brain. It's like you just, you're feeling like, okay, well, it's a win if I get out of bed in the morning. But we did go back, and one of my memories is I remember Leah just, in his crib for like 3-4 hours, right? It was hard. It was hard. And we never stayed there. We gathered some things, and I he loved his fish. I had a pond. Um and he called them fuffs. And this pond was not nice. It was just disgusting, right? But I'm like, I'm sorry. I'm like in there, like, up to my waist, like trying to catch every fish I could. And, one of my best friends back home, was like, we're getting those fish and we're going to put them in a new pond. That was pretty cool. Um, there's the relationship, I was angry and not approachable for years. And, Leah cried. I took maybe 5 months off work. One of my great buddies, Jason LaFave, um, he set up a GoFund. We sold our house. We were on one income. I was teacher salary, just starting my business. It wasn't like we were, we were, richer. So that we're, one of the things about when I look back, when you're just feeling that thick grief, it's hard to say thank you. And I don't know if I ever really took the time to say thank you to people. So I want to take that time. I mean, I'm so grateful for just all the help and everybody. It was tons and tons of people. The funeral, I don't, it, I don't really remember it. You don't ever have to think about, you don't ever plan to do this type of stuff, right? Are you going to cremate your kid? Are you going to, are you going to bury him? Are you going to, what is he going to wear at the day of the funeral? And are you going to do open casket? And are you going to do, so there's just so much. But one of the things that I took from my experience, and I don't know, if any folks have ever heard of tapping, but I remember just being in a straight panic. And I did speak at the funeral, Leah and I did. And Bessel Vanderkolk, he's Dutch. He does a thing on tapping. And it was something I had some trainings with him with like secondary trauma and developmental trauma. I remember like tapping through that whole funeral, and it got me through it. And that was extremely difficult. But just back to the thank you thing, like I think, when you're in that sort of grief for years, which it's hard to it's hard to say thank you. I was very closed off, and I felt like everything was probably owed to me. And, I had this experience that was just, I couldn't
An
appreciate.
experience that changed you.
Yeah.
It changed you. You weren't the same person anymore.
Yeah. I was not the same person. And it was, I'm not proud of that person, but at the same time, I did do many things that I am proud of, and I'm going to talk about. I made some really big decisions. I didn't drink for 7 years. And that was a decision that I made, that I was like, I need to feel the feelings. I'm not going to mask the feelings. I have a family to take care of, and that is definitely not the road I'm going to go down. And I feel very grateful that I took that path, because I don't know if I would be where I am today if I did that. So at that time, I took a behavior specialist position in St. Johnsbury, and I had to work. I think 5 or 6 months went by. Leah and I we were living with my parents, and that was just like, there was too much grief under one roof. It was like my mom, who, obviously lost her grandson, and then like, her feeling like she would still have to take care of us, and seeing how she almost lost me, right? As a person, I'm a different person now. And her daughter-in-law, everyone, it was too much. So we caretake this property. I was starting to build the house. I was working as a behavior specialist with like 80 kids on my caseload. And I was still like, not okay, right? Like, not okay. And the family relationships just changed so much. And I could just feel when people got around me that I was like, they were unsure how to approach me, because I was unapproachable, and was just so hurt and angry. I was just, I could go out and build a stone wall for like 60 hours straight and just punish my body and scream and cry and just and that's sort of how I dealt with it. And I didn't really want to process a lot of questions or have people, I guess, worry about me, but it probably made them worry, more, So I think also another part of my perception of people and, people start giving you advice. And after like a couple of months, they start to give you advice. You should see a therapist. You should do this. You should do that. And I think one of the most important things about helping somebody in grief is supporting them and knowing the difference between support and advice. It's really hard to take advice. You're really just trying to survive, and there's such a difference there. And I struggled with, I struggled with like seeing the good intent behind what people were trying to do. So I was at St. J Middle School, and I think that was a step in my healing journey. I mean, while you really shouldn't take care of other people while you're sort of beat down, I mean, there was such a sense of perspective there. Just the stories that I saw day in and day out. I mean, that is a very tough population there, and just a lot of drugs and a lot of physical, sexual abuse and neglect. And it really gave me a lot of perspective. Yeah. At the same time, my wife and I were talking about having a child. And we were going through IVF, which was pretty stressful. But there was a gentleman there, Brian O'Farrell, who was, I mean, just such a beautiful person. Brian was my person, and he he was a guidance counselor at St. J school. And, you know, I would just go in and, after working all day, would just go in, just break it down, you know, for hours, no matter what. He was always there, and he offered so much insight and, into my journey. And it was a great experience, and having those folks to lean on that, he had a significant loss in his family, his brother, and he was just one of those my people for sure. And I think we all have those people on our journey. And, I've met others since then. Brian unfortunately passed after I moved back. He actually passed on my son's birthday. And I said I would never speak at a funeral again. And I spoke at Brian's funeral. And at his funeral, I met his brother. His brother is definitely, now one of my people. One of the And we always, stay in touch and go grab lunch. And we don't see each other as much as we want, but there's that connection for us with Brian and Gunnar. So, we had my wife and I shortly after we had the first time IVF, got pregnant with Luna, and Luna was born on the 13th of February 2018. And, I gotta say my life definitely changed. Again, I felt that. It was probably the first felt like that pure joy, uh, being a father, and just that love for your children. And so she's now our little moonbeam. We call her our little moonbeam, and she's 8. And she's just, yeah, she's definitely the best medicine there is. Having a child after losing a child, it definitely creates a different lens of life and how you approach parenting. And, we were scared. Like we were, Leah and I, for, I mean, the first 3 years of her life, probably, I mean, we took shifts and watched her like we watched her. We didn't put her in a crib. We didn't sleep. Yeah, we watched her. We were so scared. And, we brought her to Boston Children's Hospital, and she had EEGs and EKGs and genetic testing. And, they didn't find any sort of link to Gunnar in any way. And I guess I don't know really how you could, because it's unknown, right? But, that was definitely exhausting. But what we had to do to feel like, Luna was going to be safe and it wasn't going to happen again. So that's really, where things started to take a turn for me. I mean, I knew I don't know that I had smiled in 2 years, I don't know that I did. And having Luna it was just that it fulfilled a monster hole. It didn't go away and it was still pretty big, but it definitely filled a huge hole. So I think,
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
I would imagine in some ways, right, it kept both you and your wife alive. The hope of
100%.
from the pregnancy to the birth to the doing, like, it was your lifeline.
100%. Like, I don't know, like, even now, like, I don't, she's my entire purpose, and I don't, I don't know if anything ever happened to her. I don't know. Like, I don't know how I get through, like, she is definitely keeping us alive, you know? I think there were many keys to my journey and I didn't do it perfectly, but I did it definitely not perfectly, but I did it my own way. And um, I think I'm very proud of, my decision to not drink. Um, and I'll like, I'm still not, any of my friends would tell you I'm not a drinker. I'll have a glass of something nice now, here and there, but like, I've never really been a drinker, but it was definitely something that I knew that I wouldn't be able to handle. Another thing is, the self-care has been huge for me. I really try to prioritize sweating and hiking and being in nature, sunshine. I mean, even like 3 years ago, I remember just putting on a backpack and I would play I Am Not Okay by Jelly Roll, and I'd put like 40 pounds in my backpack. I would just walk up and down a hill and just, and like, frost sweat and like people probably saw me and thought it was crazy. But just like physically grounding myself and like letting that out was so important. I also just like connections. I have some of the best family and friends. I mean, there's just, people can, people with hardship will sometimes connect themselves to, drama and negativity. And I always just wanted to, made sure that the people in my life were positive and we're going to add something and we're, just solid people. That was really important to me. And I have such a good group of friends and family. And it took me a long time. I mean, I think it was scary, not just losing another kid, but also like getting like that sense of like almost like reactive attachment, and losing other people was hard. And again, it took me 4 or 5 years. It's been 10 since Gunnar. He was born in 16. Yeah, it was, no, sorry, 2014. Yeah, I mean, I think about the people and some of the things we do. I mean, this hat right here, it's Collins Pines Gunners. And when I was living caretaking that property, my gardener and some of my friends, like, I hadn't left the house and I was literally working, trying to support my wife the best I could, which there's no textbook, and they picked me up. And at that point, you know, I think they picked me up in November after that summer, and we decided we were going to go on a hunting trip. And really, it was to get me out of the house. And we've done it 10 years straight, and it's evolved into like kind of my friends, and it's all about, my son and all of us making sure we continue to, honor him and share those relationships and connections and positive experiences. And we all love being in the woods, so it's pretty cool. But they picked me up, and that was one of the first times I'd been away from the house from Leah. And I just I cried all week. I couldn't even, like, I'm hunting, I'm doing the thing that I love the most, and they had to drag me out of the truck. I couldn't even, like, it was just crazy. And I couldn't even function. But it was like one of the first times that I was not sort of taking care, or it felt like my feelings were at that point, my grief was more at the forefront than it was in the house, because, it definitely hit Leah extremely hard.
You could let it out because you could let your grief out because you were
Yeah.
staying strong for
Yeah.
everybody else.
Yeah. I mean, I sort of always like pretended like I had it together, you know? Uh, like, cause I had to work and I had to build the house and I had to do, I had a lot of responsibilities to keep things. I just had to kind of fake it till I made it. And then as soon as I left her for that week, I was just like, I, it was crazy.
Dan, can you speak to, I mean, you're explaining stereotypical imposed manhood, right? So well, in terms of what did you do? You thought, I have to care for my family. And you've also, on the other side of things, talked about this amazing group of males you have that got you out to actually feel your feelings.
Mhm.
Can you just talk a bit to I don't know if pressure's the word, but the how it was being in a home where you had to care for others' grief? I mean, I imagine it slowed down your ability to process it, or potentially the anger lasted longer. Like, did you consciously think of that at all? Like, I need to get away.
I felt very guilty getting away. I think that I got more resentful towards Leah as time went on related to like, we have to it was hard because I had expectations for myself and as we know, people that grieve, they grieve very differently and their timeline is different and they they process things just so differently. And my expectations for myself were different than her expectations for herself. And that created some friction because, I felt like maybe she should have been further ahead. Looking back, I wish I could have been not grieving myself so I could have supported her differently. But as you two know, it's like you just, it's hard to make those really good executive decisions, when you're in the thick of it. I don't know if I answered your question. Um, you know,
Yeah, in part, I think, I mean, the work I do, I'm a psychotherapist, and over 90% of my clients are male, right? And I think of ranging from, early 20s to in their 60s. And I think generationally, younger generations are doing a bit better as males. But I'm just wondering, kind of you experiencing it, what would you suggest? What could have been helpful to you? It sounds like that, your group of friends did the right thing. But what advice, if a male wanted, would you give regarding the need to care for yourself and to grieve?
yeah, I have another buddy, Jamie. We call him Jaime. There would be the only other times that I really left the house when we were living over there. I would, dude, I'm just not okay. He's like, I'll come pick you up. We'll go for a ride. And keeping things very simple, and that's why he was so great because there wasn't a lot of processing, but he'd like come pick me up and we'd go for a ride and we just shoot the shit about the weather and, keeping things very light. And I never felt like any judgment or any advice, or it was just very like, he would just, he'd give me a hug, or he'd put it, or just, he's so funny, like humor. He's hilarious. He's just such a funny guy. And I think about how much that meant to me, and yeah, it was just simple humor, keeping things present, talking about what was going on, oh, look at the, how's the weather and simple things like that. But yeah,
I
it's
think, yeah, I think that's amazing advice. And I mean, I learned some years ago, which I think is very true, when within a therapeutic setting, is to ask, would you like advice? Could I provide you a suggestion? How can I be helpful to you? Right? Because someone coming into your space and going for the advice, even if it is well intended, it might not at all be helpful, right? And to
right.
ask that question.
Yep.
Well, and I liked when you said earlier, you would want support, not advice. You wanted support. You didn't
Yeah.
want the advice.
No, couldn't handle that. That was hard. That was hard. And, so I connecting with people, that was so important and so grateful for all those people and family. It, and I was difficult. I was, like I said, I was difficult. I was not okay. I mean, you wouldn't want to hang around me. I wasn't, it was like talking stone, and And then my folks along the way that have had grief journeys, that's been really important for me because I tend to, even, the past 5 years, I feel so much different, so much happier and healthier. But I know I'll feel it, like I have to let it out. Like that's why I this talk has been great, but also like connecting with those people like Liam and Tom Lovett, who was, St. J Academy. He was a headmaster and also lost a child, and he ran my son's funeral, and just a brilliant guy. And you know those are the folks that when I see him, I'm like, I'm in tears, right? But I need to, like, I need it, or yeah, it's so, I've also been, so I talked about the decision not drink, nature, my connections, projects. I really like to stay busy physically, that sort of thing. Helping others is always been a passion of mine, and I still continue to help folks, and I still work directly with a client, and I'm constantly reminded of, I was a grown man and I had this trauma to my brain, which, it's definitely impacted me. And I was going to talk about that a little bit, but my brain wasn't still developing, and feel for those folks, the kids, the trauma at such a young age, when I can't even imagine. I can't even imagine dealing with something when your brain is still developing, and how that really would it impacts you, right? Your social, emotional, your skills, and your ability to have healthy relationships and coping. And so I'm just so grateful, and when I'm giving back to people and helping them in difficult situations, because again, it's helped me, and that's something that I always just want to do because, and people talk to me about my experience, and they'll always minimize their own experience and their own trauma because they'll try to quantify my experience as so much more impactful. And I'm like, no, no, no. Like, perception is real. Like, don't minimize. Like, I don't like when people do that, because as we know, like, a car crash is traumatic, and that could be more significant to them than my loss. I mean, maybe that's not a good comparison, but does that make sense?
Yeah, I think you're making very valuable points on pointing out the brain development and having empathy and consideration for someone who is younger with a developing brain.
Yeah.
Because those memories, right? It's a snapshot. It remains in their brain and may forever affect, right, how they're able to learn new things
Or not,
or
you know?
not. Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And what was the second point you said after?
It's just like people would always,
Exactly. Yeah.
they would compare their trauma to mine,
Yes.
and they would try to minimize their own experience. And it would always make me feel so
Mm.
bad. I know perception is reality, right? And like, I was, yeah, what I,
It speaks to the fact that you're a very naturally empathic human being, right? I imagine you work a lot off of feelings. You have gut feelings, right, regularly that are probably accurate. But you're absolutely right. Like, experience is relative and is that person's lived experience. So to compare or to minimize, right, is taking them outside of their pain. And
right.
you want to make sure people get to feel their full weight of pain.
Yes, absolutely. And I think one of the last things that I did a lot as part of my journey, and it was just like basic brain science, your thoughts dictate your feelings and your feelings dictate your behavior. Like, I constantly was retraining my self-talk and my perspective, and really around, I am frigging lucky. I am frigging lucky. I am so grateful that I had my son for those 2 years than never at all. Right? Like, I there's so I can think of like 100 different things that I would just, self-talk, to get me through. Like, it's pretty easy, right? It's pretty easy for folks to fall into that victim mentality, right? And sort of go into that the pity party, and like That is never what and I am so grateful. I am so fortunate. I am so lucky. That I have so many things, so many connections, so many amazing friends. Like, I'm so grateful. And it's easy to, when you're having a bad day or, you have those thoughts, right? To think, you know, to quickly go south. And I had to really teach myself, and sort of just change my thought process. And for the most part, I do really well with it.
I was just wondering, and I don't know if you have an answer for this, but was there something that you said you were just angry for so long, for so many years? Was there something that just like clicked for you, or what helped you turn your grief into gratitude?
I thought you were gonna ask what specifically why I was like, "Agree," but it's I mean, honestly, the birth of my daughter was like the planting of the seed, you know what I mean? It was like the day that I knew, I finally just started feeling so much different, and that purpose of being a father, which I always wanted to be. You know, I I was so angry because I felt like that was robbed from me.
Do you see pieces of Gunnar in your daughter, Luna?
All the time. And I was gonna talk a little bit about like how I have changed. The Luna and I for the first 2 years, like I didn't really talk a lot about Gunnar, and it was hard for me, and now I wish I had more because I've forgotten a lot. I've forgotten a lot of the memories, and I'm so grateful for the pictures and photos and like fuss. I hear the word, when I said fuss earlier, I can still hear him talking once in a while, like the way he would say birdie or, buggy. I always, whenever I say like or good night, he would say nun night, because I can hear it. He talks to me. The parts that I kind of wanted to touch on were just how I've changed. Oh, and that was part of it. It's just I'm so lucky. I feel so lucky I had Gunnar 2 years and never at all. And that took me that was probably like year 4 or 5 after his passing, and that I got to that point that I even considered saying that. You know what I mean? Like, and I truly that is, I see so much my daughter in him. And, yes, I had hard feeling about having like when we found out we were having a girl, I was like, I had a hard time with that. But at the same time, like now I think it's for the better that we had a girl because I think it would have been more difficult, like comparing and this and that and yeah. So the one of the things that really changed for me was the grateful piece. I mean, when Gunnar was on this earth, I mean, I was a worker and I definitely was a great dad, but I definitely missed moments, as a sole provider. I missed moments. Work was a stress for me. I didn't, I wouldn't prioritize, and you hear people say cherish every minute, right? I didn't cherish every that is definitely something I do now. Like, when I have my daughter, it's not like I'm out doing yard work and she's inside. Like, it's you get my undivided attention. What are we gonna do to have an awesome day? And like, yeah, it's changed me in that way. Like, and I'm very grateful for that because truly, I don't know, parents say that, but it's pretty easy to get in the pattern or rut of, go get on your iPad or you know what I mean? I get it. Sorry, hold on. So that definitely for me, work is not work's important, but it's something that I can shut off. And, if I have my daughter 50% of the time, and, I'm planning things well in advance for her to have every opportunity and privilege and experience. And there's really nothing more important to me than that. Yeah, I guess one of the other things that really changed was nothing is really a crisis to me anymore, and at work with, people, with relationships, with, just day to day stuff. I mean, I'm pretty flatline, I'm a problem solver. I don't, nothing is really a crisis, and having that tragedy really puts things into perspective. And yeah, that's sort of how I look at things. I definitely get way more emotional, as you saw a little bit today when I talk about it. I definitely cry a lot when I watch like silly, happy movies. If I'm by myself, like, I can't watch like, you know, I can't watch like a Disney movie or like a cute happiness without crying hysterically. I was never like that. Yeah, that gets me every time.
So that's I would say that's great to the
It
extent
is.
if you're needing a good cry, just
Yeah,
throwing a Hallmark movie and Dan's
yeah.
gonna
We're
you're gonna
like
get it out.
the
Yeah.
Hallmark movies,
Yes.
like those happy, joyous moments at the end every time. And then one of the last things that's changed is that we talk about him all the time. Gunnar and with Luna, it's great. I mean, he loved rocks. Everyone at the funeral brought rocks, and I made this, sort of shrine out back patio with all his rocks. And, every time we cross a brook or a pond, he was left handed. We throw a rock, left handed. And, just the sayings and the words and things, we just try to honor him and remember him and talk about him. Yeah. And Luna's great. I mean, she's, yeah, it's great. So, I mean, that's really all that I sort of have. I mean, obviously we've done things differently with Luna, and all's been good, and so.
You if I can go back, just some struck me was when you mentioned Brian and then Brian passing
Mhm.
on Gunnar's birthday.
Crazy.
Um, I was just curious, right? That makes me think of where we honor people who have passed and we love, but do we feel them or do we believe connections are what does that mean to you? Right? Like,
I mean,
what is your belief, whether it be spiritual or what did that mean to you?
I
And
mean,
in general, yeah, go ahead.
I just couldn't believe it. I felt more, there being some sort of higher power need for both of them. I mean, Brian was just in that they're together and like the fact that it was on his birthday and Brian was my person, he was everybody's person. I mean, he was, 250 kids sort of mentor a day in that school. There was While there was so much sadness around it, there was also a little bit of relief, I guess. And now I'm just like connected to his brother, and who just I would have never had him in my life. I mean, he lives over here in Chittenden County. Like we basically are neighbors, and we see each other often. And it's just, yeah, it was wild how it all happened, and
There's definitely beauty in that, right? Or at
for
least
sure,
that's what
absolutely, yeah. And I told myself, I'm like, I'm never speaking at a funeral ever again. Obviously, that was and then I mean, there was no way I could not. Brian meant, he meant so much to me, and he knew Gunner, and he was just. I mean, what he does for kids in this world and makes them feel safe. I mean, he was just, yeah, confident. Just the type of person you would want attached to my son for sure. Oh no, that made me feel good.
well, we're coming on to the hour. Mandy, I know this podcast too is very much for Declan. Just wondering if you had feelings that came up or additional questions with this shared loss.
No, but I could relate to a lot of what you were saying, especially, and it was just like you quoted me on
Yes, a
how,
few times
yeah,
he quoted
just like, I'm so grateful that I had him for 9 years, then not at all. And I would go through all of it again to have those 9 years, then nothing at all. And that I learned a lot from him. He
Mm,
taught me a lot, still teaches me a lot.
yeah,
Uh,
makes me want to be a better person.
yeah. And your daughter, I have a little one that's younger than Declan and he acts like Declan.
Yeah, feels.
And so it's kind of funny because Finn was 2 when Declan passed, so he didn't really know him well. But I talk about Declan all the time, just
Yeah, so it's normal.
yeah. And he talks about Declan all the time now too. So like when we see a sunset, he'll say, "Oh, Declan painted the sky for me tonight."
Aw, I love
Yeah.
that. Yeah, Luna calls her brother Angel.
Mm.
She'll tell her teachers or her friends, "Yeah, I have a brother. His name's Angel."
No. But no, I
Beautiful.
definitely understand a lot of where you're coming from. And I'm just happy for you that you have gratitude after.
I know. Yeah, I'm so glad as well. I mean, it took a long time. It's been like 10 years and that's one of the other things I really struggle with, like dates. Like we just had his birthday in November, and like it's hard to, and that was actually one thing I was going to talk about is my brain. My brain, I mean, I've lost so many memories of like, I can't remember a lot of like my college, high school memories. I definitely have to have a lot of spreadsheets and take notes, or I forget things. So it's like just now, I don't even know what we were just talking about. My brain is definitely way different than it used to be.
It literally changes us, right, to go through
Yeah.
that and to experience. I think it's like grief and gratitude is a spectrum, and also it is like can be simultaneous, right? It can
Mhm.
be sometimes inseparable. And I don't know that our brains are necessarily equipped until they experience, right? And then we have to adapt or not.
Yeah.
And so, right, there's loss there, and then we adapt with the memory, with the spreadsheets and so forth.
A lot of spreadsheets.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Write everything down.
I want to thank you so much for reaching out to us and for coming on and for sharing your story. I really feel, well, you're our first man to come on our show too. And I think it's really important to, a lot of things you shared, I think can be beneficial to others, especially males I know that wouldn't otherwise feel allowed to feel openly. So I'm
I,
very
I
grateful.
I'm open door. Anyone ever wants to, contact me or go grab dinner or chat. I mean, I totally would. I've always loved, not always, I've definitely become able to love sort of that role, as my time is, more recent here, but open door. Anyone ever wanted to contact me, that's definitely, I'd like that.
Amazing. Thank you, Dan.
Yeah.
And I
Crystal,
think,
Amanda.
yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. And if you know anybody that wants to share their story, if any of our listeners want to, they can message us on Facebook or Instagram at Grief and Gratitude Podcast. And we have an email address, griefandgratitude2gmail.com. So that's it for today. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Dan.
Bye,
Bye.
girls.
Consider being a supporter of the show by downloading episodes, subscribing to the podcast, or clicking the support link in the show notes. You can also leave a 5-star review wherever you listen. If you would like to share your story, please message the Facebook or Instagram page. You can also email griefandgratitudepodcast@gmail.com. Tune in next Monday for an all-new episode. This podcast was created to honor the memory of Declan Shaw ONeil and Jennifer Lynn Berry.